All right, recording in process. This is the second part of my video series that are coming out where I am recording my presentations that I gave at conferences for the year of 2022, right around the time where I started my PhD program. And this second video is essentially important because I'm going to be talking about what I'm going to be focusing my dissertation on specifically, and everything kind of after this and everything kind of, and then the zombie feature before this is going to um is going towards this particular idea in my PhD. So just let me go back to sharing my screen again, because I will tell you, and it's not just me, but others are, we're always very paranoid that like someone's going to steal our idea, or someone's going to be like, oh, I got to use your stuff. And I doubt, like, everybody's working on very important things, that I doubt anyone will try to take what's mine. But I had originally submitted this proposal back on October 31st, wow, Halloween of 2021. I guess I was pretty boring to be using Halloween instead of partying to be submitting proposals. But I presented on literary eugenics, the eraser of indigenous peoples in horror, mystery, and plague literature. So I did get to present this on April 13th, 14th. No, I was I was day one. So I was the 13th. I was April 13th, 2022, when I presented this at PCA. PCA 2022 was online. We were originally supposed to have it in Seattle, but everything went online just due to COVID and things like that. So literary eugenics is a term that I came up with during my research for the zombie. I remember thinking, like, I never heard anything about the mermaid or the siren or even the witch being used as a disabled figure for females, or that it was possible when the original image and, Dante's poems and things like that were coming out, um, that was even a possibility. It seems like we have to keep going in and digging through and digging through and digging through and seeing what was the original message, what was the original content, what are symbols that we are using in modern society, that we are using in pop culture, where do they come from, what's the rhetoric behind it. And I have determined that eugenics is playing a huge piece. I know people are like, well, it's just time, it's just education, it's just things like that. No. We have to understand eugenics has touched every part of our modern society, even in ways that we have forgotten about it. And I'll get to that a little bit more in the presentation, but this is where I came up with this particular wording for literary eugenics. So we have quite a bit of information on how eugenics has impacted the food industry, how it's impacted the medical industry, how it's impacted certain laws and formations of certain sterilizations, how even our eugenic laws in America influence Hitler and the final solution and everything that he was doing with the Nazis. And we have all of this material going back very far on what it's done to, indigenous people, to Afro and Black Americans. But we have never sat down and said, has eugenics impacted our pop culture? Has it impacted the way that we read stories, the way that we compose stories, the way that we put them together? At least in any of my research, I have not found that information. And so I was like, you know what, the literary literature industries have also been impacted by eugenics. And we can clearly see that in certain in certain of the examples that I'm going to use. Now, I would have very much liked to take literary eugenics a little bit further in my zombie film or presentation paper. If you did watch that, I mean, I did point out that while I was looking at women of color versus Anglo white women. I particularly wanted to focus that particular zombie paper on indigenous and native women to the Americas, especially with the sterilization, since the zombie that I formulated was the zombie came about due to infertilization. The zombie came about due to certain other motifs that needs to be looked at much more heavily. I will, by the time my dissertation is completed in the next 3 to 4 years. But I did not get to that in that particular paper whatsoever. But and then I think even in fictional literature that could be explored in a way that still shows your academic pursuits and the way that you're looking at this academically. But so literary eugenics is my term that's used. So if you do use that, you have to cite me. And I mean, I can show you here, like, I've been thinking and working on this for some time, but I do know that sometimes we're paranoid that someone's going to take our ideas. But if this helps you in any way whatsoever, I mean, by all means, use it. And so, like I stated with the last one, this is still very early 2022, where I was following my graduate mentor on your papers need to be written out in a capacity. You need to read them verbatim, or you need to have some type of well-composed speech that you can talk. You could just basically read it from, look down, look up, talking to the mic, things like that. And it's not any type of interaction that I would do today. Because especially with teaching, I wanted a little bit more of a natural presentation. So unfortunately, I do not have very many, PowerPoints or anything to show you. That is going to come later in this series when it gets dropped. I think the next 3 are going to have PowerPoints, and you're going to see how it completely changes the way that we present this. But I will jump straight into what I was discussing in this particular paper, Literary Eugenics, and how it and the erasure of Native Americans in mystery, horror, and plague literature. And the reason that I start with horror is because I do have to talk about Claire Cover. Like I said in the last video, anybody who is big into horror, pop culture references, academics, you do know who Claire Cover is. She talks about the final girl. That's usually what is focused on in her book. Now, she does spend maybe 5 paragraphs. It's like all of 2 pages on this one idea that I am particularly honing in on for this paper. And she talks about how horror film, horror stories, horror plots, the construction of horror films are actually Native American. Let me go into what I mean by that. She talks about, like, The Hills Have Eyes. Like, The Hills Have Eyes. She's like, these are actually Native people. Like, think of it as like the Oregon Trail, right? You're going, but now it's a modern caravan. You're going with your family. You're going into an area that you don't know, kind of touristy. And then here are these Native people that are like, you are interfering in our territory, right? And then pursue the cannibalism and obliteration and things like that. So she's like, this is Native. Another one that she uses, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There's a lot of rhetorics, a lot of dialogue about, this is my land, this is my property, this is why I'm able to do these horrible things. Again, another cannibalism motif. And then she talks about how, like, some of the ornaments and some of the decorations that they have in there, she's like, these are traditional pieces that Native Americans would use to decorate their house and things like that. But and then there's many others that I mean, we could spend 2-3 hours talking about the different ideas. Now, the thing is that horror movies have always been they've always been advertised towards the white American male. Why? Because they get to identify with Michael, they get to identify with Jason, they get to identify with Leatherface and things like that. Um, Horror has become a substitute for pornography, right? We can't watch pornography, we can't do any of that. But we can go watch Halloween, Video 6, right? And enjoy that. And people, it's not as morally wrong as it would have been pornography. So this is why they are the niche audience members. Now the thing is, she says, if Leatherface, if Jason, if Michael happen to be casted as Native or Black men, white men would not go to the movies to watch them. They would not rent the videos. They would not identify whatsoever. Michael running around, killing white women. The same thing with Jason would not be fun and pornographic anymore. This would be hitting on some, I don't want to say insecurities. Insecurities isn't a strong enough word, but this is the propaganda that has been used to display the violence towards Black and Native American men. Because I'm trying to remember, this is going on YouTube. We're not in a conference setting, but I think you're understanding what I'm saying is that now Michael Myers being a Black man changes the story. Now him murdering white women is no longer pornographic. It's no longer sexually entertaining. Now it becomes frightful. Now it becomes a reason behind why we've had eugenics and lynchings and other things like that. So she's basically saying many of these stories have been rewritten in a way that will no longer have Native American or indigenous features because it's not sexy. White men and women would not flock to the theaters to watch anything like that. So it's impacted the horror industry that way. That's the first type of erasure that we're getting into. So the second type of erasure, besides horror, that I do talk about is plague literatures, plague films. So we have this idea also that Native Americans never got sick. They lived in these, in this kind of Garden of Eden utopia like Americas until the white men came over. Now, yes, that's true, but in regards to illness, they were not super beings that didn't get sick, that didn't get infections or anything of the like. They just did not have an immunity to European diseases, like bubonic plague or anything like that, since that did not affect this side of the world. This did not affect them as a community. They had no defenses whatsoever on how things spread. Now, if you go back to William Bradford and his writing of Plymouth Plantation and the formation of that, Native Americans did get sick. Like, they're like, if you drink water that is not good, yeah, you're going to get sick. Like, you're going to throw up. There was a breakout. I think it came from the cicadas and breeding in water that would cause people to get sick. Apparently, cicadas or chichadas, whatever you're from, like their skin has a lot of bacteria that you can't formulate. They go through like a 17-year cycle of when they come back out and are, their populations grow. Now, the natives did tell the settlers, like, this is what you need to look for so that you do not get sick from this bacteria, from this particular insect. Do not eat this, do not eat that. This is how you check for water. So I'm kind of like, we have to rethink how this has been pushed towards us. And again, you can kind of dive into monsters a little bit too, of maybe like the Wendigo is a parable on how to eat meat properly. Because if you eat spoiled meat, if you eat rotten meat, you can get very sick. So this might have actually been a parable to teach you do not eat rotten meat. Of course, with white settler mentality, the monster, like everything became evolved around them. That, you know, we are the monster, because natives had no concept of ontology and being and medicine before them, which is absolutely wrong. So in this plague idea, now we're trying to say, okay, no, it was there. We do need to talk about it in a different way, right? Eugenics has played this idea of this is what we want to talk about Native people. This is what we want you to believe. And how does this translate into stories? I think I should have actually hit mystery off first before this. Now I don't have a way of editing because I'm just a simple PhD student, older millennial, like I don't know how to use any of this stuff. So forgive me, but I'm going to go back to mystery for a little bit, because the way that eugenics comes out in that particular genre is through the biracial identity, which again, part of eugenics is not only who are we allowing to breed, but who we breed with. So this idea of if you can't kill the Indian, you can breed the Indian out of them. So in the mystery, we have quite a bit of the neurodivergent biracial detectives that come out that have very much qualities of, I have this analytical reason, European, of how I'm going to solve this crime, but I also have this spiritual connection. I also have like a way of communicating with the beyond and this native instinct that comes out. So we have quite a bit of stories about that particular detective coming out. Now, I don't focus pretty much heavily in there, but I kind of roped that in there with the horror. I don't think I wrapped up horror very correctly, but I'm going to get heavily into the plague literature because the way that the example comes out is through Jack London's The Scarlet Plague. Now, Jack London was a eugenics individual, very supportive of it. If I call him a racist, I know in some circles he'd be like, well, let's not phrase it that way. But in other circles, I mean, it's exactly what he's saying. He was a journalist at the time that did not want boxing to be racially integrated. He did not want other races to participate in the sport because he called it a very pure sport that should only be left for white men to fight white men. So there's quite a bit of, you can see where he pushes his own agenda. And in the Scarlet Plague, it probably takes about 3 days for the entire world to fall apart because of this very fast moving plague. It's like if you stare at somebody who has like this plague of bleeding, it's like, all right, you got it. And within a couple of generations, he basically says that we're all going back to being indigenous people. And he displays it in a way that it is wrong. So the main character in that particular novel, sorry, like I know even just reading this, like it was triggering for me. So I did not remember a whole lot of Jack London's The Scarlet Plague for obvious reasons, but it does very clearly demonstrate how eugenics has been integrated into literature, into our stories. Eugenics, if I didn't explain it or you don't have an idea of what it is, it's like it is like Charles Darwin's survival of the fittest taken to the extreme, right? Instead of we are going to allow evolution to breed and bring about the strongest and best traits, we are going to make them. So we're going to use sterilization to take certain genes out of the pool. We are going to probably incarcerate certain people. We're going to institutionalize certain people to also get them out of the gene pool. You might be familiar with ugly laws, which was anybody who displayed an overt physical or even mental, like something that you could see clearly that this individual had a disability or had something that was different about them. They were not allowed in public. We have, like I said, we have a lot of research on how the institutionalized psychology was heavily influenced by eugenics and eugenicists practicing members, the incarceration system, the education system. We have a lot of research about that, but nobody, to my knowledge, has ever said, how are we using literature to basically do the same thing? Removing and, removing these unwanted traits. And so the way that we look at these unwanted traits is by, let's look at the horror films and see how they are removing Native people from Native stories. Because it's only a good thing if the perpetrator is white. It's only fun. It's, because then it becomes a political statement and other things in horror films. And then in the mystery literature, the way that is pushed is that we need everyone to be biracial, and any of the indigenous aspects of you are so internalized that we can't see them. Because usually with these biracial neurodivergent detectives is that they're always white passing. They're white featuring, so they might be blonde hair, green eyed, but their internal part of them with prayer connects to ceremony and things like that. Now with the Scarlet Plague, if you sit there and read it, it's like 105 words. But his main character, James Smith, right? Like, you should have just called him John. Like, you should have just called him John Smith, right? For the English explorer, going through native populations and being able to take over. Jim or James Smith is also a professor at a university before the world kind of falls apart. Then the world falls apart and he becomes this hoarder of books and texts and literature, and he is waiting to breed an army in order for the John Smiths to take over. Because now that this plague has acted like a catalyst to remove laws, it's like a very Hobbesian idea of, if we have this plague, the world's falling apart, society's broken, we've lost that contract. Smith is kind of on his own, right? And he has to wait. Now, within 3 generations, essentially, Smith is like, we've all become native again. And it's native in a way that's it's just disgusting. Like, he has his grandchildren. He has his favorite, which is Edwin, who looks more like Smith. He does have verbal communication. He's basically being indoctrinated by his grandfather. I think he calls him like grandfur, or it's a play off of grandfather, but it's not grandfather per se. He's the only one that also has an Anglo Aryan name. And he's being indoctrinated by his grandfather to also hoard this wealth of information so that they can take society back. Now, his brothers, which are Ho Ho and Hair Limp, for obvious reasons, they're very much playing on this idea of how natives get their name, which is not anything like that. They are called red-skinned. They're called a little bit more animalistic, because they've spent so much time in the sun that they almost don't pass as relatives of Smith and Edwin. They also do not have the ability to communicate effectively. They're very violent. Again, things that, I mean, we can clearly see what he's trying to say. They're also featured in native clothing, like he says that Hair Limp and Ho Ho, which that they wear moccasins, and they have bow and arrows, and they chase after deer and things, and the rest of their body basically goes naked. Now I did find an article by Leon Jackson that talks about Indianation through the antebellum American culture. So his word of Indianation is when white Americans take on the act of speaking, looking, dressing, or any way of displaying a native person. And then he talks a little bit about Edgar Allan Poe, who also had the nickname of Mohawk, and it says because when he was criticizing other writers, he was as brutal as a Mohawk Indian scalping. Quote from Jackson. So in a way, during the antebellum American culture, Indian nations were looked as a good thing as long as the individual displaying these features were white. And it's basically what Smith, who's said to be basically a mouthpiece, a stand-in for London in this novel, that he's basically saying the same thing. Like, oh yeah, we're Indian, but at least we're white about it. So the whole idea is to take Ho Ho and Hair Limp and the other quote unquote savages and convert them back to being like Edwin and Smith. And Smith, of course, is hoarding all of like European novels and literature and the Bible and things like that. So it's like, now that we have enough people that we can fight. And he does talk about because the story takes place in California. He does talk at the end about, oh, we're near Los Angeles, and Los Angeles has all of these brown people, the Latino people, and he's like, we're going to very easily take them over, and we're going to be well on our way to this like society that we are rebuilding in our image. And of course, the image being the white Aryan race. So this was a great example on how one particular eugenicist is using their platform as a writer to demonstrate kind of like how we can change something, right? Like a germ might have happened naturally, but it very much sounds like bioterrorism. We're going to destroy everything and then recreate it in our image. And now that there's not a lot of people that can either stand as a contradiction or can't point out how eugenics has interfered in the past, right? Because if we didn't have histories, we didn't have people, we didn't have any of this, we can change all that and use whatever histories that we want, which is what sounds like Smith as a professor who's now in this other world wants to do. right? He's not going to give you everybody's point of view. He's not going to give you anything like that. He is going to give you the information that he wants you to have that will better serve him, and essentially, I don't be like his race, but you essentially get the idea behind that. Now, this book came out over 100 years ago, and if we did not have a platform to talk about eugenics or anything of the like, we could also kindly forget that Jack London was pushing a certain agenda, and he pushed that agenda even as a journalist. So it wasn't just as a fictional writer. He was very open about his eugenic beliefs, about condoning certain actions and things of that nature. So what happens when we take something like the story and we're like, I'm going to rewrite this, or I'm going to provide a story that's similar to this or anything, or I'm going to teach this in a certain way? Now we get literary eugenics, because I'm covering up all of the past historical content that has gone into this, and using it differently, or using it in a way that can easily be not connected back to eugenics. Like, I'm sure we can look at The Girl with All the Gifts and not see any of the eugenic interpretations or anything that came from, eugenics culture back in the day. We're like, oh, that's not what the story is about. But this is what the story is about. She's taking children, she's experimenting on them without their consent, without parents. She's murdering them. These kids are institutionalized by the military, of all things. So there is a eugenics story in there, but it doesn't get talked about. And that's the whole purpose behind this particular presentation and my dissertation, is how can we talk about it, and how, once we talk about it, how can we kind of say, this is how eugenics has created our literature. It's created this sort of rhetoric that we are still using, that we are still essentially fighting with, because that's what Melanie is. She's fighting against this eugenic culture of Dr. Caldwell murdering children, and children particularly like her. And while race isn't necessarily said, but she is a zombie race. It is her race that is being prejudicial against. It's her race that's being targeted. So there is eugenic properties here. It just might not get said. It just might not get looked at in a certain way. So in another presentation, that's probably going to be number 4 in the series, because I don't present that until 2023. And I'm trying to go in order. I'm going to say it's going to be pedagogy, and it's going to be a certain type of pedagogy designed to look for eugenics that might be hiding in our literature, might be hiding in our rhetoric, and how we can teach students to kind of look for it in order to not erase certain races or certain topics of conversation, right? So this was the erasure of Native American people through certain genres, and it's not because they don't exist. It's because eugenics has played a part in how we tell certain stories. So like I said, I have a lot of examples and everything on how this could be used for my dissertation a bit. This was just mainly a snapshot of where everything got started for me, as far as that's concerned. So please leave me any questions, comments, concerns, feedback. I'm very open to feedback, very open to comments. Please be respectful about them. Because as academics, we do have to talk about conversation. We do have to talk about topics and conversations that are just uncomfortable, that nobody wants to go through, that we don't want to rehash, that we don't want to trigger anybody, but sometimes they are important enough where we have to. So, please leave me any of your thoughts. I'd be more than happy to kind of chat with you a little bit to see, how this can change or how we can better this by any means. But well, this was part 2. Hope you have a good one.